The Paris Law Courts, October 2003. In the dock was 44-year-old Margaret McDonald. People were fascinated by this well-spoken Englishwoman on trial for procuring. She was alleged to have set up on her own a multinational sex business, an agency of over 400 girls.
She was the Madame, but a 21st century one.
Margaret McDonald was the 2.0 version of Madame Claude, the famous procurer who supplied call girls in Paris in the 1970s. To journalists who squeezed into the court, Margaret McDonald was a pioneer, a cyber procurer.
She was ahead of her time with regard to technology and quickly realized how much the new technologies could help her business.
In prostitution circles, Margaret McDonald was unusual. She'd studied business and spoke 6 languages, a rarity among those who are called madams.
In that world, you're more likely to come across people who are losers.
But above all, Margaret McDonald's personality needs to be understood. Beyond the facts of the case, hers was a complex psychological world, full of contradictions to be decoded.
Margaret McDonald needed an entourage. She needed girls around her who idolized her and needed her. She set up her own sex family.
Axelle was a member of that sex family. Back then, she worked as an escort for Margaret McDonald. Axelle is therefore best placed to shed light on the Englishwoman.
She was very hard, but straight. She paid us on the nail. When she owed us money, she paid immediately.
With others, Axelle's testimony will help us to reconstruct the practical, intellectual and psychological path that led Margaret McDonald to become the Madame Claude of the 21st century.
It's just like setting up a company in anything, so it doesn't matter what I'm selling, I can do the same thing. I like to see myself as the Bill Gates of the escort world.
To learn about Margaret McDonald, you need to go to England to see the places, the atmosphere of her childhood. It was here, beside the River Thames, that the as yet ideal little girl grew up in the best British tradition. Windsor. 30,000 inhabitants, 40 kilometres west of London, and close to Heathrow Airport, one of the largest in the world. Windsor is a town with a very particular atmosphere.
Windsor is a middle-class town, I'd say. It's quite smart. I think I'd compare it to Versailles or Fontainebleau.
The town is twinned with upmarket Neuilly-sur-Seine. Windsor's landmark is the castle, a residence of the British royal family. The Queen of England lives in this imposing building when she's not at Buckingham Palace. On street corners, Queen Victoria's likeness reminds people of the former greatness of the empire. Jane Hosmer attended the same all-girls school as Margaret. She recalls the 1970s in Windsor.
It was quite a conservative town, and everybody, everybody was very sort of guarded with their behaviour. There wasn't a lot of wild action, and there wasn't that much to do. There weren't that many places to go.
It wasn't by chance that the McDonalds, originally from Scotland as their name indicates, moved to Windsor. The town matched the lifestyle of Margaret's parents, Matilda and John.
Her father had served in the British Royal Air Force, and then apparently became a businessman.
In Windsor, Margaret's father decided to settle the family in the heart of the St Leonard's area, a private and affluent residential neighbourhood away from the town centre. It was in this large, comfortable 5-bedroom house that the girl would grow up with her sister Eileen and her brother Kenneth. Margaret was the eldest child. Days were spent in study, supervised by their mother, who'd become a teacher later in life.
One can imagine that the atmosphere in the home was one of strict discipline.
A town with age-old traditions, a strict family. Naturally, in her childhood, Margaret McDonald attended religious schools, like St. Bernard's Convent School. Every day of lessons started with prayers.
Convent school is run by the Catholic Church, and often the teachers will be nuns, so it's on very strict religious lines.
Catholics are in the minority, of course, in Great Britain. But the schools are usually very, very good, with strict discipline. A convent school education often means a very good education in Britain.
Even though Axelle was close to Margaret, there was a certain reticence when it came to talking about her early years.
Margaret never ever talked about her childhood. It was almost taboo. I think she didn't want to talk about it. In my opinion, her childhood and education were quite authoritarian. Not necessarily unhappy. But anyway, she never talked about anything.
At the age of 16, in 1979, Margaret left her religious schools and moved to an all-girls state school. Uniform was compulsory, as usual in England. The teenager seemed quite solitary. She wasn't known to have any close friendships, the sort that normally help you through things at that age.
When everyone else has been there for some time, you've made your friendship groups. And I think it's hard, isn't it, when someone comes in new to sort of break into that.
Her teenage years were hard because she didn't necessarily feel good about herself. She had no friends, she wasn't outgoing.
She didn't stick out particularly.
Growing up in a town like Windsor, I can imagine that if you were a boy or girl with a spark of rebellion in you, it would be the perfect situation to inflame those sorts of feelings.
But at the time, there was no reason to think that the quiet Margaret McDonald would one day lead a life that was the complete opposite of her education in Windsor. London at the end of the 1970s. Margaret was 20 years old. At the time of the punk rebellion, the young woman chose to liberate herself through study. Margaret enrolled at the Polytechnic of Central London. Business and management were her chosen subjects, all very conventional.
The college she went to, Central London Polytechnic, at the time had a very good reputation, particularly for languages. It was practically oriented, and there were a lot of exchanges with other European countries.
Margaret made the most of it as she had an exceptional gift for languages. In 1982, aged 22, as part of an exchange program, she finally left Windsor and her family. It was her first real escape from the family unit. She headed to France and Reims. She took a course at the École Supérieure de Commerce. Her name appears in the alumni directory for 1984.
She knew France well. She spoke French well. She was very comfortable in it. Her educational career was exemplary.
With good qualifications and especially knowledge of several languages even then, French and also Italian and German, Margaret McDonald looked ready for the jobs market. However, the young woman seemed much less comfortable in her social life. For Margaret, that wasn't the most important thing.
From what I understood, she had no friends from university or any very close friends. So I think she was a very solitary person. She liked the solitude, but also suffered from it. In the courses she took, You didn't have to display your emotions. She studied economics and management. She didn't do fine art or sociology or psychology. She placed herself in the category of someone who likes to control their life. There was also a falling out with her family. She lived a solitary life.
After her degree, relieved to be free for the first time, and far away from her family and the niceties of English education, Margaret decided not to go back home. The bright lights of Italy attracted the young graduate, particularly those of Milan, the economic capital, which was both industrious and fashionable. This was where Margaret decided to start her working life. She went into marketing. She spent 6 years trying to find her feet, taking on jobs that seemed in the end to disappoint her, as much by their content as the salary. It was the end of the 1980s, and Margaret was nearly 30.
We know that she did a whole series of what we call graduate jobs, but she didn't stay in any of them. So she didn't progress. Apparently, she was fired from several of these jobs.
She couldn't stand having a boss telling her what to do. I think that when she was in her trial period, people didn't keep her because she was impossible. She had a terrible attitude.
In spite of everything, Margaret still believed she could succeed. After losing yet another job at the start of the 90s, she placed an ad in the American International Herald Tribune newspaper, offering her services as a personal executive assistant. She dreamt of managing the schedule of a captain of industry, traveling the world beside him in a private jet.
She had everything she needed to succeed in a more normal, more typical career.
Margaret had 20 replies to her ad, but they weren't really what she expected. In the very serious Herald Tribune, job seekers' ads were placed beside those offering the personal services of young women. Clearly, that gave people ideas. Out of the 20 replies, 19 men called Margaret, offering to pay her as an escort girl, in other words, a high-class prostitute.
This term, escort, has obviously always been very ambiguous. And you could say that it's because it's ambiguous that it's originally an English expression. It hides something. It doesn't want to say what it is.
What is an escort compared to a whore? I don't much like that word. An escort is a top-of-the-range prostitute. She's not a girl who's going to spend 15 minutes with you in a car or behind the bushes or in a basement. You'll spend at least an hour with her, if not the night, or even the weekend. That is an escort.
At the time of the Margaret McDonald investigation, Patrick Ivar was the number 2 in the BRP, the Vice Squad. He'd seen plenty of escorts at police headquarters.
People use an Anglo-Saxon word to dress up an activity which is said to be the oldest profession in the world. When you're an escort, it's not quite the same work for the prostitute. When you're an escort, it implies that the service you offer is not only sexual. You accompany businessmen to business dinners in the evenings. You claim to be a translator, and you speak several languages. It dresses up the profession a little, but it's still the same job in the end.
Margaret was surprised, even shocked by the replies to her ad. The girl who had still never experienced a real love affair became bitter. She couldn't have imagined that this unfortunate experience with her ad would determine the rest of her life. In Milan in 1992, Margaret's life changed. She was 33. On paper, there was a world of difference between the English girl from a good family and escort girls. And yet the replies to the ad in the Herald Tribune had surprisingly sowed a seed in the young woman's mind. She went for it. Next time Margaret McDonald placed an ad in the paper, it wasn't as a PA, but as an escort. The question is, why did she come to make such a radical decision?
She said at her trial that she had a debt to pay off, and that was why she worked as an escort the first time.
A debt contracted in Milan? If true, surely the Englishwoman could have found a solution other than prostitution. The reason must lie elsewhere. There were deep-seated psychological reasons that drove Margaret to act in this way.
She was up for a challenge. 19 men replied, "I'll try it. What's the risk? Maybe I'll get something positive out of it. Maybe I'll discover a different world. Maybe it'll lead to something else." She gave it a try. Daddy was in the military. Her education was very strict. It's revenge on her upbringing. I was under the thumb. I want to blow that apart.
It's the act either of someone who is really desperate or of someone who has the capacity to be quite cold.
But there was something else that might have driven Margaret to try working as an escort, something much more deeply rooted.
You could see she had a grudge against men. She said nasty things, how they were all bastards and they had to pay if they wanted us, and that was all they deserved. She mentioned a man in a swimming pool that she'd been very much in love with. I wondered if he may have been a teacher. There was a German too at one time, but that was very brief. She never wanted to go into details. You could tell it was something that really hurt her. Like me, she'd had a very unhappy love affair and she never got over it.
So she felt an enduring resentment towards the male gender. But as strong as that feeling might be, how did selling her charms give her revenge? On this point, Axelle completely understands Margaret McDonald.
Like Margaret, I had two very hurtful love affairs. My first love in particular, and then someone else that I met at Air France who let me down badly. I think he had a lot of fun with me, and in the end, I got fed up. I told myself that I didn't deserve that, and he had to deserve me. And she thought the same thing, that men had to deserve us. Why should you give yourself for free and in the end be unhappy and get dumped? So, like her, at one time I thought, unconsciously, that we should make guys pay for hurting us and for enjoying us, if you like, in every way. I think that in the end, we're the ones who win, because either they don't get us, or it's for money. So they don't have us completely, rather than these girls who go with everyone and anyone for free. I think we have the advantage because at least we get paid, so we're valued.
With her analysis, Axelle has given us an essential piece of the puzzle if we want to reconstruct and follow Margaret McDonald's psychological journey. We must remember the context at the time when she first tried being an escort. She was on her own. She had no boyfriend. She wasn't earning as much money as she wanted. And another key point was that Margaret didn't feel at her sexiest. She'd put on a lot of weight. Becoming an occasional escort opened new doors to her and put some excitement in her life.
She liked it. She said she discovered another world. It was a magical world with polite men, and it was certain, given that the man was paying, that she'd have sex. If she went to a nightclub, she wasn't very good. She might go home on her own. This way she knew she'd have sex. and come out of it with the money.
Money, sex, and luxury. Margaret's life was turned upside down. For her first paid sexual encounter in a smart hotel in Monte Carlo with a well-educated Englishman, she was paid a third of her monthly salary at the time, nearly 3,500 francs. In 1992, that was a tidy sum. Her lawyer, Emmanuel Marcini, one of the best-known criminal lawyers in France, remembers that Margaret at one time even mixed business and feelings and had a long-term relationship with one of her clients.
Je crois savoir de mémoire qu'elle avait eu une relation.
I think I recall that she had a love affair. Indeed, she told the police and lawyers about it, with someone from the Middle East who was quite well off financially. And, as I remember, things didn't end well between
De
them.
mémoire, les choses ne s'étaient pas nécessairement bien terminées.
The romance ended after 19 months, but Margaret didn't take it as hard as she usually did. For the first time, she had the feeling that she was in control and making the decisions. Paradoxically, by occasionally working as an escort, Margaret McDonald was becoming more relaxed around men. She was more cynical too, since money was now a driving force in the life of this woman in her 30s. Lisa knows all about sex and money. This French woman has lived in Geneva for nearly 15 years and runs a brothel there. Like Margaret, Lisa started as an occasional independent escort. The two women worked at the same period, which was a prosperous one.
Just before the end of the 90s, it was possible to earn good money. Very, very good money. To give you an average, and I was the mother of 2 children. So I worked relatively rarely, but back then I could often earn between 25 and 30,000 French francs per month. Money was important. Living comfortably was important. As she didn't have friends or any real social life, she always ate out. She made the most of life, and for that she needed money. Money was really important.
For someone from her background, it must have been a big step. It's almost as if once she'd made the move, she had no boundaries.
With no more inhibitions, Margaret McDonald was on her way, even though she was playing closer and closer to the edge. By becoming an escort, Margaret McDonald had opened a kind of Pandora's box, and she wanted to go further. After 3 years of her new life, she saw the chance to set up a real business around this work. The idea of an international escort agency grew. This was in 1995, when Margaret was 36.
She didn't get up one morning and say, "I'm going to set up an international network of escorts." The reality is always more complicated. Margaret McDonald was an escort herself. She'd met a number of other young women who became friends at first, who also worked as escorts. And naturally, since she spoke several languages, was organized and businesslike, she took charge of things, if I can put it like that.
To her lawyer, Margaret McDonald apparently set up an escort network almost by accident to help people out. But Mr. Marcini knows that his client was too intelligent not to realize that in setting up this business, she was becoming a procurer in the eyes of the law in certain countries, including France.
The fact of putting a client in contact with a girl who prostitutes herself made her a procurer in France. That's not the case in England or Germany or other countries. Margaret went into this world having studied economics and management. So she used all that background to set up a business. She could have set up a property company. She could have bought works of art. She chose to sell girls and to make money out of them.
In order to sell, you need to find clients. Margaret knew the system and that she could use ads in the Herald Tribune, a newspaper distributed all over the world.
It was a small ad in black and white. High-class escort service for smart gentlemen. Something like that. There was a phone number in London. She had an English phone so that it would look smarter. Then it said, service of 1 or 2 hours to accompany you to receptions and dinners. That was all.
With one ad, Margaret was killing 2 birds with 1 stone, because the phone number would also be used by girls who wanted to work for the agency, like Axelle.
I was an air stewardess for a Japanese airline that paid very, very well, and it was a fixed-term contract. After 5 years, the contract ended, and I had to apply to another airline like Air France. Air France took me right away, but my salary was halved, and I was used to having a nice lifestyle. I lived very comfortably. So I talked to Charlene, a Chinese friend who was very clever and spoke French and English very well. I said, I don't know how I can stay in my apartment because the Air France salary isn't enough. And she was the one who said, why don't you become an escort? I said, what's an escort? She said, you accompany businessmen, nice men, and you make money. And it's an occasional thing. I thought it was brilliant. I was young and green. I didn't know anything about it. So I bought the Herald Tribune. But quite honestly, I never thought for a second that it was high-end prostitution.
Axelle rang the agency. Margaret arranged to meet her in Paris, at a café near Place de l'Étoile.
It was nice weather. She was very casually dressed. I wasn't expecting someone like that, because on the phone she sounded very sensual and quite young. When I arrived, I found a woman who was quite overweight. She had grey hair, not very tidy, a supermarket plastic bag that she was using as a handbag. It was very quick. There were 2 girls before me. It was a bit like a screen test. You sat down, she took a Polaroid photo of us, we showed our ID. Back then there weren't any smartphones, so she couldn't take a photo of our ID. She wrote down all the details, and then she said, I place you in category 1, 2 or 3. The 1s were not great, frankly ugly. The 2s were average, and the 3s were models. There were some models, so I was in the 2s.
As soon as she started her unusual business, Margaret honed her working methods. To meet potential escorts, she was perfectly willing to leave Milan, and she travelled a lot, even though it meant considerable hotel and travel expenses.
She wanted to meet all the girls, because she wanted to know who she was dealing with, and she wanted to be sure who she was sending to her clients. She wanted quality merchandise.
One person is particularly well placed to talk about Margaret McDonald. That's the public prosecutor involved in the legal proceedings against the Englishwoman. Marie-Hilda Guinot was particularly struck by this case, mainly because of Margaret McDonald's personality. She was an unusual sort of woman to find in prostitution circles.
Margaret McDonald was keen to pick women of all kinds, but they always had to be smart, with a certain allure. They had to know how to do their makeup and to dress wonderfully, but not in a flashy way. Not at all like streetwalkers or whores. We could play a role. If the client wanted a vulgar sort of girl, we could do a bit of role-playing. But it's true that the girls weren't at all like the girls on the street in the Rue Saint-Denis. No, there were a lot of students, quite a lot of models. There were girls who were managers of shops for major haute couture brands. There were all sorts.
So Margaret McDonald looked mainly for girls from polite society, but the real strength of her agency lay elsewhere. Margaret learned how to use the new technologies of the late 1990s like no one else.
It was a time when the internet was only just starting. So, as she had studied economics, she was able to use all these tools that she had available. She had several mobile phones, she had several SIM cards, she had a computer. She used everything that she could.
She was ahead of her time with regard to technology and quickly realized how much the new technologies could help her business. She needed to be easily contacted in many countries by people in many countries, and sometimes more or less anonymously.
Quick response times and discretion. In practice, Margaret used several telephone lines. For clients, she had a Swiss number, an Italian one, and a UK one. She set up another line exclusively for calls from the escorts. And she also had a phone that allowed her to make calls withholding her number. Technically, Margaret got it exactly right. Her clients liked the way this virtual agency worked. The technological approach combined with the young woman's commercial and marketing know-how was spot on.
In high-end procuring, given the prices charged, you have to please the client so that he comes back on another occasion for other girls. That means you have to know your clientele.
It's the same thing in good hotels. When an important client arrives, the room is prepared according to their taste. If they like purple roses, there'll be a bouquet of purple roses. If they like kiwis, there'll be kiwis in the room. That background is all noted down, and she was very careful about that because she wanted a good client base.
It's true that Margaret McDonald took her conscientiousness as a procurer to new heights, because she kept a note of many facts about her clients so that they'd be satisfied next time around.
Margaret would know, for example, that one client would want an escort in black underwear, while another one would want only white underwear. With this extreme attention to detail, the Englishwoman's agency started to get a good reputation after 2 or 3 years.
The milieu of prostitution is, in fact, quite a closed network. It's very small. Everyone knows each other. Even though at the time I didn't know the other girls who were prostitutes, I knew them indirectly through the clients that we had in common. She was a woman who was respected by the clients. The names of clients. Basically, they were what we now call celebrities, sporting celebrities, TV celebrities, and industrialists.
The names of Margaret McDonald's clients? I think I've forgotten.
One thing was certain. The agency's clients were wealthy people who were ready to pay out large sums of money for the girls selected by Margaret. At the time, Axelle earned a lot of money.
It was huge. You wanted to do it again. It was a kind of treadmill. You earned so much money that afterwards you didn't want to work anymore. In 2 hours, you could earn a month's salary for someone on the minimum wage. It was huge. Some girls worked full-time. I did maybe 3 clients a month because I also worked for Air France, but it helped me to live comfortably. I could live in a nice apartment in a smart neighbourhood and spoil my mother or help friends in difficulty. At the time, I earned for 3 clients, and I worked for other agencies too. I earned maybe 20,000 francs a month. That was after commission, and in addition to my Air France salary.
But the real winner was Margaret, who took a hefty percentage of the fees for her escorts' meetings. And that's the definition of procuring.
For the payment, she charged 5,000 francs back then per session. She took 40%, so we kept 3,000 francs, and we sent her 2,000 francs. The Western Union money orders were never sent in the name of Margaret McDonald, but Helena Canias. I remember she had a Credit du Nord account in the name of Helena Canias.
Margaret had opened that account in a false name in Spain. At the end of the 90s, Margaret McDonald's business, employing dozens of women across Europe, was flourishing. In Milan, the Englishwoman could indulge herself. She even let herself relax. She spent hours here at the Harbour Club, the most upmarket sports club in the Lombardy capital, and the luxury shops in the Victor Emmanuel Gallery were now affordable. Margaret lived on the Via degli Odescalchi in a smart apartment block in a bourgeois neighbourhood. The business was doing so well because Margaret was involved in all the everyday details of running the agency, a management style which struck Daniel Rigor, the then head of the BRP or Vice Squad.
She managed everything from A to Z. To use an old-fashioned term, she was the madam, but a 21st century one.
She drove the escort girls that she employed. We had to choose a pseudonym. When I said Helena, she said, no, it's too Russian. So I said, well, an A and an X. Do you like Alexia? Yes, Alexia is fine. So that was how it worked. When she rang me, she never used my real name. She said, Alexia, be at the George V in 3/4 of an hour. She imposed her will on other people. One girl said to me, you know, she would sometimes come to a first meeting with an important person to see how I was dressed, and she'd say, you've got too much mascara.
Margaret McDonald sometimes went much further in her need to supervise her girls.
She had a real sensitivity and was very cultured. She was able to quote English or German poetry, both in her English mother tongue and in the original language, to explain something that she wanted one of her escorts to do.
But in Margaret, conscientiousness and a sense of organisation often verged on authoritarianism and a desire to dominate.
She knew exactly when I had my days off, so that she'd be able to arrange work for me or not. And when I came off shift, I was exhausted. I sometimes went to bed and she'd ring me at midnight or at 1 o'clock and say, you've got a client in half an hour or 3/4 of an hour at the Crillon. And I'd say, but Margaret, my nails aren't done. My legs need waxing. You must be ready, so you're at the hotel in 3/4 of an hour at the latest. You must always be immaculate when I call you. This is the last time I'll tell you. Next time, I won't call you again. She scared me sometimes. I shook when I answered the phone.
Lisa can understand Margaret's abruptness with the girls and analyses it for us.
I can be quite blunt in the way I talk to them because I know exactly what goes on when the door's closed and you're alone with a client. Margaret McDonald was someone who had organised things very carefully and intelligently. She was a real company boss. She was quite irritating and offensive. Her way of managing money, the girls, the meetings, scheduling their time, it was a terrifying job. And she carried it out without any consideration for the person or anything else, whatever she said. She carried it out just as if she'd been selling clothes or whatever else, with a calculated profitability. She was very hard, but straight. She paid us on the nail. When she owed us money, she paid immediately. We didn't have to wait 3, 4, 5 days or a week. On the other hand, we had to be really straight too. She was very hard, but very straight.
Everyone who worked on the McDonald case or knew Margaret personally agrees on one point. Apart from the money, there was something else that drove her to do this job, an unconscious psychological motivation.
I think she had an emotional problem, and she compensated for it by eating. But she only ate very good food and drank very good wine. She was a gourmet, so she went to amazing restaurants. Yes, Margaret ate a lot. When I met her, she was almost obese. She was huge. Food was her only pleasure. She had no partner, no family, no children. She had no real friends. Eating was what gave her pleasure. It was probably the only thing, but I don't think she was happy. I think she was a very unhappy woman. I don't think Margaret McDonald liked herself much, so I think she had a great need to be loved. She needed to compensate for a lack of love. Perhaps her parents weren't very loving, or not as loving as she would have liked. So she sought out clients who needed her, girls who she helped to earn money and who earned money for her, with whom she built up friendships. For some of them, she became like their mother or their big sister. So there were all these bonds. For a solitary girl, it was wonderful. She was at the centre of the web she'd woven. She was the boss of it all, the manager. She was also an inveterate dispenser of advice. She said, "Be careful, you must do such and such with this man. You must treat him in this way." At the time when she was doing this, Margaret weighed 100 kilos. She didn't prepare herself specially. I think that she looked for girls as she might have collected paintings. She was a collector. And if you're a collector, you go to look at paintings. You enjoy looking at them, touching them. She did the same thing with her girls. I think Margaret needed an entourage. She needed girls around her who idolized her and needed her. She set up her own sex family. She had a sort of basis of understanding with the women who worked with her. Firstly, because she was the example. She had succeeded, and secondly, because she arranged everything for them. These girls would phone her often to see if they could have some work or some money, and she allowed them to make money. She made a lot, but so did they. So she had lots of friends around her, lots of prostitutes, and they were beautiful girls. She was no beauty, but she was surrounded by the most beautiful girls. When I was working on Margaret, among others, I read that she used to ask them intimate details of their sessions with clients. She'd ask the girls, "How did that work? What did he do? What did he say?" There was a certain enjoyment in listening, a certain transference. She said to herself, "I could do that too." And she was also attracted to some of these girls.
In the early 2000s, the agency was at its most profitable. Margaret was just 40. She lived between Milan and Athens, where she'd also bought an apartment. Margaret returned only rarely to England. It was as if she'd forgotten her family. She'd settled into this strange life which carried her from airport to airport, from hotel to hotel, and she worked on her own.
Margaret McDonald, at the time, was considered as a very successful woman, at least in our circles.
Success in these circles is judged by one's bank balance. Margaret's was healthy. At the time, the Englishwoman said she made a net profit each month of £20,000, the equivalent of €32,000, enough to make a person lose their grip on reality. And it made Margaret lower her guard over the fact that her activities were considered illegal in France and other countries.
Margaret was caught because she thought she had impunity. She had such an idea of her own power that she thought, OK, France is off limits. There's a warning light over it. There are specialised cops, it's dangerous. But if I'm very careful, I can still go there.
Margaret had no idea that the French police had started trailing her in 2001.
We arrested a procurer, and while she was in custody, she said, "But other people do what I do. I know someone that I've worked for who's doing it on a much bigger scale." That was when we discovered that behind this network of, I think, about 40 people, there was a much bigger one.
They took an interest in Margaret, in her network, and gradually they worked their way back to Margaret. They tapped her phone for months before they found out when she was coming to France and when they'd be able to pick her up.
Margaret's strength was also her weakness. Her strength was to be very organised, but her weakness was to be too organised and to trust no one and do everything herself.
Margaret came to Paris in May 2002 because she couldn't and wouldn't delegate. She came from Brussels to meet a girl, a potential escort. Margaret arranged to meet her in a cafe near Place de l'Étoile, close to the hotel where she usually stayed. The opportunity was too good for the officers of the Vice Squad. Margaret McDonald's arrest took place quietly, with no shouting or fighting. At the same time, Danielle Rigaud's men searched her hotel room. They hit the jackpot. Margaret realised they would seize her computer and the game would be up.
She was unhappy when we took the computer because she knew we'd decrypt it and analyse it completely.
Margaret kept all her records on this computer. Every one of her escort's meetings was listed over nearly 7 years. For Daniel Rigaud, this computer was a gift, almost more than he'd hoped for.
It gave us the list of all the girls under contract to Margaret McDonald. And there were over 400, 430 if I remember correctly, and about 20 boys.
For the Vice Squad, this was an enormous catch. Margaret was taken to the BRP headquarters at 36 Quai des Orfèvres.
That day she was quite stunned, quite dazed, and rather despondent. Quite a cold expression. I remember passing her in the corridor, and she didn't look very engaging. But you can't expect procurers in custody to look engaging when they've been arrested by the Vice Squad. That's not always possible. She said, "I'm just a businesswoman. I have an agency. I contact women and put them in touch with men who want to spend an evening with them while they're on a trip to Paris. They want company, someone pleasant to talk to or to introduce as their personal assistant if they have a business dinner."
When Axelle found out that Margaret was in custody, it was both a surprise and a shock to her.
When I heard she'd been arrested, I was on holiday in Guadeloupe, and so I quickly came back to Paris. After all, she'd helped me to make a lot of money. And when I called my air stewardess friends who'd worked for her and said we had to help her, no one wanted to know.
Margaret was taken to prison in Fleury-Mérogis during the investigation. The British Madame Claude, as the press called her, was judged 17 months later on the 23rd of October 2003. Ironically, Margaret was celebrating, if that's the right word, her 44th birthday.
For us British correspondents in Paris at the time, it was a good time. Obviously, she was English, British. So there was a certain amount of interest from this side of the channel. But it was also all about sex and Paris. This story had everything going for it.
At the Paris law courts, the atmosphere was feverish. Many journalists wanted to tell the story of this unusual procurer, this unconventional madam with a degree who spoke 6 languages.
It's true that this was an atypical profile. In that world, you're more likely to come across people who are losers.
During the trial, Margaret adopted a very theatrical attitude. The public prosecutor remembers that.
I was struck by her arrival in white, her relaxed attitude, and at the same time, her self-affirmation. She wanted to be judged as a woman and nothing else.
And yet she was judged as a procurer. But the prosecutor took into account the unusual aspects of the case. No criminal record, no violence towards the escorts, and no human trafficking. While she could have asked for up to 10 years in prison, Marie-Hilda Guinot only asked for 6. In the end, the court sentenced Margaret McDonald to 4 years in prison and the maximum fine of €150,000. Margaret returned to prison. She'd already spent a year and a half there. Axelle was her only link to the outside in that time.
It was a celebration for her when I visited twice a week. It was Tuesdays and Fridays or Thursdays.
Even in prison, Margaret still exercised her authority over her former escort.
We wrote to each other 3 times a day sometimes. She begged me to send her at least 1 or 2 cards, not letters, every day, so she could cover the ghastly walls of her prison cell. Early on, she told me that I had to send her money orders. So at least once or twice a week, I sent her money orders. She promised she'd repay everything when she came out, and she said she'd owe me big time for the help I'd given her. Margaret had a real hold over me.
Margaret didn't spend 4 years in prison. After serving 2 years, she was allowed out. Her sentence was reduced. When she came out, Margaret McDonald agreed to take part in an unusual venture. She appeared in a no-holds-barred documentary. This film, from the UK television's Channel 4, is the only footage showing Margaret McDonald. She probably also received a substantial payment, as is the custom in England, for agreeing to be filmed this way. For Margaret, this film was like a public platform. It allowed her to give her version of the truth.
Running an escort service is legal in so many countries. Just because it's illegal in France and I went to jail for it, why should I be ashamed?
The unashamed Margaret McDonald even implied that she'd opened several accounts in Jersey, one of the most popular tax havens in the world. Clearly, with her money stashed, Margaret was comfortably off.
Plus £40,000 in the other Jersey one.
She said to me, "When I come out of prison, I'll set up the biggest escort agency in the world, and you'll be my right-hand girl." And she really believed it.
Axelle has now lost touch with Margaret. No one knows where she is, except perhaps her lawyer. What has become of the enigmatic Margaret? Today, people can only speculate wildly.
When you've had easy money, it's hard to return to a normal life. I suppose she must have set up a brothel somewhere in Europe, probably, or a website. I expect she's still making money in the same business, but I don't think she'd take the risk of coming back to France.
Although it may make people laugh, I could easily imagine her in something like an NGO.
She's made a fresh start. Her life today is very different from what it was back then. And I can tell you that without fear of contradiction.
It's funny. It's hard to judge her personality, her smile, her eyes. She tended to stand a bit like that. She was self-conscious. She held her head down. You could see that she wasn't comfortable in herself. But you can clearly recognize her. But her hair was going grey. She was always cheerful and smiling when we went to a restaurant. She was never grumpy, but she was still someone very hard, closed in. It's really not a very good memory.